Hello, everybody. This week, we have been studying the cultural aspects of learning, particularly in our classroom environments as teachers. We are working very hard to find ways to teach our ELL students in the best ways possible. And to do that, we've had to research some background information and what makes our ELL students who they are and where are they coming from, what happens in the home and in their background that affects what they're doing today in schools. So here we go. Some background information. I was very curious to find out some more information about Koreans and Korean Americans and how they are affected in our American classrooms or our United States classrooms. I had a student last year who was of Korean descent, and he definitely inspired me for this presentation. So the Great Schools staff quote there just reminds us that there are a plethora of pieces that are going to affect our students, including gender, age, their societal piece, and their other background information. And I like this quote by Kim, ELs are the fastest growing population in U.S. schools. What a great reminder to us that now more than ever, it's so important to be aware of our kids and where they're coming from and how do we help them grow while celebrating their culture in home as well as our culture in the school classroom. So again, I was very inspired by my Korean student last year. He has a mom who is Korean and speaks only Korean to him at home, and a dad who speaks only English. So he was raised bilingually, and a little bit of background knowledge with him, he's also autistic. So his schooling looked very different than a lot of kids, yet he also was so much further along than some of our kiddos due to some of what I think his Korean background culture. So we do know from research that Asian cultures tend to teach children to pay attention to a hierarchical system. So authority figures such as teachers are to be held in the highest regard. So when mom would come to school, she was one of my teacher helpers. She would bow to me. That's an example of showing respect for authority. It's also obedience in children. So being conservative, conforming, in any way to show that you are a child and you are to be spoken to and not to speak to someone else. Not all cultures are like this, but we did see some of this with my student last year that I found interesting. Learning styles typically for Korean children tend to be more independent. They're not going to participate as easily in group work. They are more quiet and they don't tend to question their teachers. So if they're not sure if that might be correct, it doesn't matter. They are the child, so therefore they're not going to question. I did see some of this with my student last year. Again, it's kind of tricky to know if it was because of his background or because of his autistic tendencies. So unclear still. A little bit more about my student. Mom was working really hard with him to make sure he always had eye contact with all adults and peers. She would actually physically turn his head under his chin to make sure he was doing that as a sign of respect. Mom also always bowed, and she did not require her children to bow, but I can attest to how I was trying to do whatever she wanted me to do to help him follow through with what he was supposed to be doing according to Mom. So moving on, there is a quote there talking about Korean students and Korean American students and how they prefer a user-friendly environment. And what that means is where they feel comfortable either talking about their culture or feeling that they are doing what they are supposed to be doing according to their culture. And that can look like a lot of different things, which we will get into. So in asking the question, what information did you find concerning the culture and the 4 domains of literacy, reading, writing, listening, and speaking that surprised you? There were some surprises. However, having the opportunity to teach some ELL students in the past, I'm a little bit more versed than I might have been in the past. Kim did a study on elementary English learners' use of reading strategies and found that if the text was culturally relevant, the students were much more likely to understand what was happening in the story, as opposed to students who had distance culture, meaning the text or the story did not have anything to do with things that they might have experienced. And that made it much more difficult to understand or comprehend. So when you're trying to teach reading comprehension in second grade, as I am, that's something I need to be thinking about for my ELLs. A surprising piece I did find in an article about online text for Korean students was that they found these students using online reading to have a much easier time comprehending the text because they were able to instantly research online, or what they cited as Googling, any information they didn't understand, vocabulary, or cultural differences in stories. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So thinking about how I might misinterpret things that my students might do or behaviors they might have due to cultural differences, really made me start to think about my student from last year, and were his outbursts and crying more from his autistic misleadings, or what could it have possibly been that it was so different from home in the classroom? This student also has a father who is military and very, very strict. And so when he gets home, he still has to study. So my student was doing 12 to 14 hours of studying and worksheets when he would get home. At any rate, there is an example in a study that was done of a Korean American student named Jae Won. And he was reading a story in his classroom. He's a second grader, called Woodcutter and Tiger Brother. It was based in a Korean experience where the main character takes care of his parents as they get older, which is something that Koreans strongly believe in. And Jae Won stated when he finished the story, he goes, "Oh, well, I agree with what he did, because that's what we do." And he says, the Korean version is better. It's my main language. The sense of meaning is a little bit better. So he had read that story in Korean and felt that it was much more meaningful than the English version. So that might be attributing some of the confusion or the frustration between home language and learning English at school, or trying to keep up with the rest of their peers. And that's something I need to remember might manifest as a behavior in the classroom. Things to also think about would be cultural norms, holidays, celebrations, historical reference, and then again, the social and emotional piece of students growing and learning while also doing these things in an environment where English is not their first language. So how might cultural aspects that you learned about make it more or less challenging for students to learn? So I work in guided reading groups in my classroom. So groups anywhere from 2 to 5 students. They are leveled based on the Fountas and Pinnell reading assessments. The problem that I'm finding is not all on-level texts are culturally diverse. The texts that we're finding for kids, although nonfiction has become more readily available in our school district, they do not lend themselves to discussion surrounding other cultures. So that's something that we need to work on, I think, as a whole in our country, is finding more text that is culturally diverse. And while vocabulary is not necessarily robust in second grade, the English language is so difficult and tricky with homophones, homographs, teaching these students here, 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 two, two, two. This can be so confusing, and I can only imagine that frustration as a young child, translating in my own brain from my home language to English to understand what is happening, but also to understand new learning. So again, I think I'm going into this next school year with much more patience for ELL students. So other pieces here, the social learning challenge, particularly in Korean, students might feel more comfortable working independently. As we know from research, there might be some fear of being incorrect, especially in front of their teacher. Implications. We have to think of literacy development and how that's related to actual language development in all of our students, not just our ELL students. So in thinking about how my ELLs are learning to read and write and listen and speak, we have to consider all of the factors. We need to consider the motivation, the social and emotional factors, so what their peers bring to the table and what they are willing to share with them. Using culturally relevant texts for read-alouds and small group instruction to help with this language acquisition and to help our students feel more comfortable. Also providing the opportunity for ELLs to write in their home language first before they then write it again or attempt to write it in English, something I want to think about for this next school year. It's also super important to be thinking about how we can combine cultural and academic opportunities across a curriculum. Further implications, things I want to change in my teaching style for next year. To make it more culturally diverse, I want to include more culturally diverse publications or books, especially storybooks for read-alouds, to have all students get these opportunities. I'd like to invite more parents into the classroom to share their culture with our class family and give more opportunities for writing in home language, or even drawing pictures that depict more of a culturally diverse picture. I'd also continue things that I already do in my classroom, asking ELL students to help teach the class some words from their home language. I often have them talk during morning meeting about something that they've done over their weekend that might be very different from the rest of our students. We use a lot of visual aids and vocabulary reminders around the classroom posted, and following my constant routines of responsive classroom. I'd like to also continue the All About Me work, which is part of the first 6 weeks program that I use every school year. And it gives a chance for kids to talk about their strengths, their weaknesses, things that they enjoy. It talks about their family and where they come from, and really helps our class family be most inclusive to all students. I'd also like to continue doing a greeting every day in a different language, so that it gives all kids opportunities to learn more words in different languages, but also making my ELLs feel more comfortable. I'd also like to continue keeping our classroom jobs to promote that class family unity or belonging, knowing that every kid is needed every day to be a part of our family to make our classroom run the best that it can. So as far as recommendations with academics, I think what I need to remember for next year the most is teaching students to build pictures in their brain, or we call them little movies, to help strengthen their comprehension. And that's across the board, not just ELL students. But that can also help build background knowledge when you're reading a story, or listening to a story, rather. Using think aloud strategies while you model it out loud to students, thinking about the characters and what they're thinking and how they're feeling. And then asking questions to allow students to really dig deeper. What did you learn from the story? What parts are most important? Or how have you experienced things like this main character has? As far as building more of a sense of community, which is just as important in our classrooms, my goal this year would be to allow for more peer interactions in different groupings. I often use whole group to small group, but I don't allow for as much pairing, which might be more beneficial to students that are English language learners. I'd like to work with my librarian to get some more culturally diverse stories for guided reading groups and read-alouds, and hopefully build up our school library. I'd like to ask ELL students to write the morning message sometimes, including words from their language, or maybe the whole thing in their language, which would be their home language, which would be really exciting for the rest of the class. I hope if they're comfortable, we can have some of our ELL students share stories of their backgrounds that are appropriate to share with other second graders. Maybe that does include bringing in more family members. And then part of that first 6 weeks that continues through the whole school year is charting similarities and differences in their classmates' cultures and traditions. And as these holidays come up throughout the school year, discussing the differences and what they can look forward to from their classmates.